Imagine it's sometime in late 2003 during the World of Warcraft Friends and Family Alpha. The current patch is 0.5.3. Rogues and Hunters are not playable in the game yet, nor are Night Elves or even most of the Horde races. Talent trees are a thing that few classes have, and World of Warcraft's many classes are still taking shape, whether that's directly on the alpha or behind the scenes. And these classes are vastly different in so many ways compared to what we got on the final launch date of November 2004, and a bunch of them went through dozens of iterations and changes before they were ready to ship. So today I wanted to cover some of the abilities which existed during this super early stage of World of Warcraft but never made it to live. And even if you're a die-hard World of Warcraft fan, I bet you'll still hear of some abilities which you never knew existed in this video, because this alpha patch of World of Warcraft had some truly wacky additions which would have made certain classes absolutely insane. So with all that said, let's make a start. But first, a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev aims to give you the tools to get fully on board with the Python and Go programming languages in order to forge a career in back-end web development. It keeps things more interactive than regular online learning courses by treating this process like a proper RPG, with leaderboards, experience, achievements, and more. And Boot.dev is a big believer in hands-on learning, and one of the key things they want to get you doing is writing tons of your own code so you can really get a solid understanding of each point. And if you do get stuck, there's plenty of help to hand, such as Boots the AI Bear, who will help via asking you more questions about what you're doing to help you understand, rather than just giving you the answers. But even if you want to just check Boot.dev out before committing fully, it really is risk-free. All the content is free to read and watch in guest mode, and there is a 30 days no questions asked refund policy, as well as a free demo of every course and its interactive features. So if you think this could be something for you, click the link in the description box and use my code WILLE to get 25% off your first payment for Boot.dev. That'll be 25% your first month or year, depending on which you choose. Many thanks to Boot for the continued support. Let's get on back to WoW. Today we'll begin with the cloth wearers and work our way up the armor types, I think, and we'll begin with the priest. The first ability I want to cover for them is called Dominate. It's basically what mind control ended up being, but instead of it being a channel, it's a 3-second cast and otherwise has a similar effect. It also mentions the target has a chance to break free every 5 seconds, which is essentially what Heartbeat Resists ended up being, where periodically the game will check if a long duration CC will end early. And I do believe even during this early stage of the game, this was a system that existed. It does have a long cast time, but it goes without saying that this would have been incredibly powerful if the priest was able to maintain a mind control and act themselves. So I'm not surprised this was later changed into how mind control would work. We also have two utility shadow word effects, both of which were removed from the game. The first is Befuddle, which slowed enemy casting speeds, and I believe this slow is a 65% reduction for 30 seconds with no cooldown. So that is Curse of Tongues on hyper steroids basically. They also had Shadow Word Fumble, which reduced the chance to hit by 75% for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Back then, spell hit and physical hit were different stats too, so essentially there was one Shadow Word to mess up casters and one for physical damage dealers. Both effects sound pretty not fun to play versus in PvP, and if you think about it, how many spell effects are there that reduce the player's hit chance? I guess it was decided that hit was to be mainly a PvE stat, and as a result abilities like Fumble shouldn't exist. Also, if you had 6 priests, which is pretty doable in a 40-man raid if you really wanted to, you could permanently debuff every single boss in the game with a minus 75% hit chance, which would totally break the majority of encounters, so I'm not surprised this one got removed. As for Befuddle, a no cooldown 30-second duration minus 65% cast speed debuff would just be overpowered beyond belief. Imagine priests in Battlegrounds just being able to spam this on anyone. Yeah, that would have been a bit too good. Next up is Mage, and they have to be one of the most changed classes throughout the alpha, as I've seen so far. And the first ability I want to highlight for them is Counterspell, but a very different counterspell to how you know it usually works. During this early stage of the game, it was a 1-minute cooldown ability, which would stop an enemy from casting their next spell for 1 minute. So basically, you counterspell somebody, they'd use their Frostbolt for instance if they were an enemy mage, and then they couldn't Frostbolt again for an entire minute. So if you caught somebody using a very important spell, Counterspell would would be absolutely devastating. Mages also had Summon Water Elemental too as their big cooldown. I'm not sure what its abilities would have been, but probably some kind of water bolt at least, you would imagine. It was removed later as Mage was not deemed a pet class, but of course this ability would make a return in the Burning Crusade as the capstone talent for Frost. Finally, mages had invisibility, both lesser and regular. No cooldown, 3-second cast, but the spell could randomly end early. So hypothetically, mages would be able to near enough permanently be invisible. That would have pushed their power level, especially in open world PvP, to crazy levels, and it's probably not balanceable as a permanent effect. But of course, again, this was brought back in TVC in a more balanced version. I think the fact that Warlock has spells like Detect Lesser Invisibility and Invisibility showed the in-game rivalry between the two classes. I mean, if you talk to a Warlock trainer as a Warlock, they've clearly got some beef with mages, it's well known. As such, Warlocks train themselves to be able to detect mages who were invisible, and they had demons such as the Fell Hunter, who could dispel, had spell lock and very high spell resist to counter casters. Either way, mages' invisibility didn't make it to live, but Warlock's detection of invisibility did, which ended up having some niche uses, such as detecting invisible mobs in Diamol West or Strat Undead. But during the alpha of World of Warcraft, invisibility was a bigger part of the game, so it seemed as though Warlocks were going to be the class to counter that, and that class flavor was at least kept for them, because as we'll see later on, there was going to be another class with invisibility, and I've kind of given it away already. Speaking of Warlock, we'll cover that next. First up is that Banish used to be a long duration CC effect, not something that's just used versus demons or elementals. In fact, the version of Banish which existed during this alpha patch may have been the most powerful CC effect ever in World of Warcraft. It was a 1-second cast, 30-second duration effect that would make the target immune but unable to act, and it also cost a soul shard. So it's basically Cyclone, but it has a 1-second cast and a 30-second duration. On top of that, and this is the really crazy bit, is this initial version of Banish was castable on multiple targets at the same time. If we check the wiki for patch 0.6, you can see here Banish was limited to 1 target max, and they also gave it a 30-minute cooldown for some reason. I'm not sure it was quite that powerful to need a 30-minute cooldown, but anyway, Banish was changed to what we know it is now just before the official launch. But this alpha version could take multiple targets out of the game for 30 seconds at a time in no time at all. Well, provided you'd farmed a bunch of soul shards, that is. Hellfire also used to be different and way stronger. It had a 3-second cast time and would last for 10 seconds, and similar to the version you know, would cause damage to both the Warlock and nearby enemies. So it was the same damage dealing effect, you just didn't have to channel it, so you could do Rain of Fire or whatever else you wanted whilst it was active. Also, it had the Death and Decay icon at this point in time, which kind of makes sense considering what it does too. Finally, Warlocks used to have Holy Ward instead of Shadow. I mean, I kind of get it, Warlocks are supposed to be opposite to the light, but at the same time there's basically next to no holy damage in the game, and there's a lot of shadow damage, so I get why this changed. Onto the level wearers next, and we'll begin with the Rogue. And Rogue definitely have some of the most interesting stuff out of any class. Did you know Rogues were the original transmog enjoyers thanks to their disguises? Disguises were a bunch of ways Rogues could learn to gain the appearances of various NPCs throughout the world, all of which needed one linen cloth and some kind of item associated with that NPC. For example, a Syndicate disguise needed a mark of the Syndicate, Dalaran Wizard a robe from them, the South Sea Pirate a deckhand shirt, and so on. I guess having a disguise would make you friendly to nearby enemies too, so you could very much hide in plain sight until you can jump some poor opposite faction player who just never saw it coming. It seemed like a fun addition to the game, but was probably deemed a bit too niche in its uses, and Rogues did already have poisons and lockpicking for their class fantasy points. And at the end of the day, if you did want to jump somebody on the enemy faction, you kind of have stealth, and that's pretty good already. The next one is something that I had no idea about at all. So during this early version of World of Warcraft, Hunters didn't have Feign Death, but Rogues did, and it was exactly the same spell Hunters would eventually receive. The difference is, and this is very in line with Rogue in vanilla, is that you needed a reagent called a Death Capsule to use Feign Death. This was made from Deathweed, which would make it to life and is used for deadly poison and some other things. It fits the theme as the rogue is the master of deception that they would have a feign death type effect, and they also had vanish by this point in time too. Why was it removed? Well, this version of feign death, according to the tooltip at least, had no cooldown, and assuming it did drop combat, this would have made rogues be able to re-stealth basically whenever they want, which probably goes without saying would be unbelievably broken in PvP. And it wasn't just rogues that had feign death either, druids could also use this ability, except it was called Play Dead. Notably, it needed 50 energy to use, so that makes it a cat form ability. Again, this fits in with the more stealthy class identity that the druid have, being able to deceive their enemies. Would have been super useful to have this on druids for escaping bad situations really, but it ended up getting removed in patch 0.9. Druids also had a long duration CC effect called Bear Hug. This bear form ability would stun both the target and the druid for up to 30 seconds, or until the druid let go, or was CC'd I suppose. A 30-second stun in PvP has the potential to be truly ridiculous if nobody could CC the druid to get them off, and it would allow an ally to basically land a free kill on absolutely anyone. Then again, the druid themselves doesn't really have damage over time effects which they could let tick down in a solo fight during the stun, or should I say they did have some dots such as Rip and Rake, but they were just really bad. And bears also had bash at this point in time too, if you're wondering if Bear Hug got transformed into that ability, but I guess they got rid of Bear Hug because it would have been either kind of bad or extremely overpowered with basically no in between the two. Next for druids has to be one of the most weird abilities in this video, called Abolish Magic. It roughly matches the Dryad ability from Warcraft 3, and I imagine a bunch of these spells have some kind of inspiration from that game, but check this out. It's a no cooldown low mana cost instant cast which removes all magic effects from a friendly target and prevents any magic from affecting them for 5 seconds, instantly getting rid of all magical debuffs, which is what most debuffs are to be fair, would have been crazy good in PvP. Then again, it says removes all magical effects and prevents them for 5 seconds, so you could grief with this ability pretty easily. Somebody just buffed everyone at the start of a battleground, abolish those buffs right off. See a guy with magic dispellable world buffs? Not anymore, you don't. Mages getting hit and they want to ice block? You could abolish them. Ice block's a magic effect, so it wouldn't work. Abolish magic in the right scenario would have been such a powerful ability, but it would have been so easy to use it wrong and very griefable to be honest, so I'm not surprised they got rid of it. Next up we have our mail wearers, and we'll start with a shaman. So shaman had some of the most insanely broken abilities you will ever see in this game. Let's start with one that's a bit more on the tame side for them though, Thunderclap. Hey, it's that warrior ability which, when you think about it, makes a whole lot of sense on a shaman, especially when they did have a bit of a tanking thing going on early in the game with the shield, the defensive talents, the bonus threat abilities, all of that. And at rank 2, Thunderclap was a 30-second cooldown ability which hit all nearby enemies for moderate damage and slowed their movement speed and attack speed by 40% for 10 seconds. It's a fairly long cooldown, but at the same time it's a very powerful debuff too. But at some point, as we well know, this ability was changed up a bit and moved over to warriors. Next up is Ethereal Form, and it's here where things start to get a little bit crazy. This is kind of a version of Divine Shield, aka Bubble, for the shaman. It was a 5-minute cooldown, 10-second duration effect that made you immune to physical damage, but also unable to use physical attacks. Another throwback from Warcraft 3, and an ability that was brought back in Legion as a PvP talent for Enhancement Shaman with a pretty similar effect. Situationally, this would have been extremely powerful. Imagine you're threatened by melee attackers, you press Ethereal Form, and then you just blast them with lightning bolts. Well, I suppose it was good if you're Resto or Elemental, otherwise as enhancement it would kind of just be something to get away. Last ability for Shaman is the Invisibility Totem, and yes, you did hear that right. It was a 5-minute cooldown, 1-minute duration effect that would turn all nearby group members invisible for its duration. So I guess Tauren rogues might not have been a thing back then, but Tauren could kind of make your party into rogues, well, at least for a minute or so. Imagine seeing a totem sitting there all by itself and then 5 people just appear out of it riding on Kodos and one-shot you. This totem would have been hilarious to see in the game and would have made for some great moments. At the same time, there would have been some very, let's say, creative uses for this, and it could have ended up being problematic perhaps. Either way, the invisibility totem didn't make it to live. Next Next is Hunter, and Hunter was the last class to be added in testing during the WoW beta in patch 0.9. The more you know, but we're talking about the alpha version of course before people even got their hands on it. Hunter pets used to have tons more abilities in this early stage of the game too. For example, Gorillas had Bruise, which was a variation of Sunder armor, and Scorpids had Dig Trap. This would make them immobile and put them in stealth, and then if an enemy walked over where they were, it would attack them for bonus damage. To be fair, Hunter pets still had a lot of abilities when vanilla released, but they used to have way more. Hunters also had a lot more shot related abilities too, such as Explosive Shot. This version had a 1-minute cooldown, cost 4 focus, and dealt moderate damage to its primary target and AoE around them. I guess most people know this now, but Hunters did used to use focus before the release of WoW, and focus worked differently then. It wasn't similar to energy where it would just regenerate and you get some focus via steady shotting. It would only regenerate when you were standing still. I mean, how are you going to focus if you're running around everywhere? Makes sense, right? Hunters also had Silencing Shot, which costs 2 focus on a 1-minute cooldown and silence the target for 8 seconds. Imagine playing versus a 1-minute cooldown 8-second blanket silence. This ability would make a return in the Burning Crusade as the capstone talent for marksmanship, albeit it had been nerfed pretty heavily, but it's probably for the best that it didn't ship like this in vanilla. And finally, our big boy plate wearers, with the warrior up first. During this early version of WoW, Cleave used to have an attack speed slow on it in addition to its normal effects. Remember, if we're looking at the game through this snapshot, Shaman still had Thunderclap, so I suppose this was meant to be the warrior's attack speed debuff. Stances were quite different too. Battle stance would give you rage when you hit enemies or when you were hit. Zerka's stance would only give rage when you attacked enemies, and defensive stance would give you rage when you were hit in combat. The rage generation was probably pretty bad with this system if I had to guess, unless you just got a ton of rage for any action which landed. It's probably for the best that this system got reworked pre-launch though. In any case, warriors were definitely the least changed class from this early stage of alpha, and ultimately most of their abilities were just renamed but basically have always done the same thing. But if warriors were the least different, paladins were the most different by far. Back then, Crusader Strike existed of course, and it would stack a holy damage debuff on your target, and then you would deal your big hits of damage with Holy Strike. This was a next weapon attack which did bonus holy damage. Also, Judgment was in the game back then, but it was essentially what Holy Wrath was, in that it dealt damage to nearby enemies. As for your seals, they existed, but they were kind of all what blessings were, if that makes sense. Short duration buffs that you could cast on allies. For instance, Seal of Righteousness made attacks deal bonus damage to the undead, and Sacrifice split 50% of damage with a paladin, which had a 30-second duration and no cooldown. Remember, these versions of seals were castable on allies by the way. I'm pretty sure paladins would have been kind of average at dealing damage, but their utility would have been absolutely unreal, even though you'd need to track several seals on party members, each of which would have a different duration, and that probably would not have been the most fun thing to do. Eventually, of course, seals were made into a personal buff which were tied to a judgment effect, and the short duration buffs became blessings instead. But this early version of Paladin was drastically different, and I think it went through the most changes from this early alpha stage to launch. And that's it, just a few alpha abilities for every single one of the vanilla classes. There's definitely more to talk through here over the various pre-release stages of vanilla, and you can see a lot of the makings of how classes ended up being, or even in some cases previews of abilities which would become available many years later. But let me know if you found anything new in this video, and if you want to see another one like it, I can definitely make that happen. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you on the next one very soon.